Recording in progress.
Okay, I think we're going to start. Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the ColorTokens Fireside Chat. Today, we'll be addressing the topic of the definition of modern zero trust. I'm Cindy Sandor, VP of Global Marketing at ColorTokens, and I'll be your moderator today. And joining me are two well-known cybersecurity experts, Jess Byrne, Senior Analyst at Forrester Research, and Rajesh Khazanchi, CEO and co-founder of ColorTokens. So I want to thank everyone for taking time out of, I'm sure, your very busy days to join us. And I think you're in for a very interesting discussion on the critical but somewhat elusive topic about what is modern zero trust and what that actually means from a research, a cybersecurity solutions company, and even a customer perspective. And our goal today is that your time spent with us is informative, enjoyable, and valuable. So before we begin, there are just a couple things to note around the Q&A. Toward the end of the webinar, we've set aside some time to answer your questions from the audience. But during the session, you can feel free to enter any of your questions into the little Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there. So just go ahead and do that if you do have a question along the way. So now let me introduce you to our guests today. First, I'd like to welcome Jess Byrne, who is, as I mentioned, a senior analyst at Forrester Research. Hi, Jess.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here today.
Oh, we're happy to have you. She contributes to Forrester's research on the role of the CISO and zero trust. And additionally, she covers continuous controls monitoring, incident response, crisis management, security training, education, certification, the list goes on and on.
They keep me busy.
It's quite impressive, Jess. That's a lot. And I'd like to welcome Rajesh Khazanchi, our fearless leader, our CEO and co-founder at ColorTokens. And aside from being my boss, Rajesh is a highly accomplished technology leader who has led product teams at VMware, BMC, HP, and Oracle. He co-founded ColorTokens in 2016 and has had the vision of bringing autonomous zero trust protection to the world. He's been on the front lines of battle against cyber attacks for more than 2 decades, and he's been awarded 6 patents for his innovations in cloud automation and cybersecurity. So welcome, both of you. We're very happy to have you. Okay, let's jump into our discussion. First, I'd like to start off by quoting an excerpt from a recent Forrester post that says, at the beginning of 2022, zero trust is facing a bizarre dichotomy. While it's on the verge of becoming the de facto cybersecurity approach, at the same time, many security practitioners claim it's just a marketing ploy. So isn't it interesting that we've arrived at such a precarious juncture? So today we're excited about discussing the modern definition of zero trust and hopefully bringing some clarity to the situation for those of you in the audience. Okay, let's get on to the questions. So this first question goes to both Rajesh and Jess, and you guys can decide who wants to answer first, but here we go. In our current technology landscape, we find ourselves in the midst of chaos, highly complex, hyperconnected, polycloud, and perimeterless environments. And at the same time, we have, these cyber criminals and attacks are becoming more and more sophisticated. exponentially increasing threats and vulnerabilities for every organization. So how do you keep your company safe from these bad guys is really top of mind, I would think, for a lot of CISOs and many C-suite across all enterprises. And in this rapidly changing environment, can you both tell us how security professionals should think about protecting their companies from possible attack and devastation? So Jess, I'll hand it off to you to give it a start.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many ways to think about security and so many angles to think of, but from recent experience with all of my CISO clients, I think you need to think about security first and foremost in terms of visibility. Right? You can't secure what you can't see. And I think as we all watch the very unfortunate Log4j situation happen in the beginning of, the holiday season, especially here in the North America, as we watch that unfold this past December, the importance of IT asset visibility couldn't have been clearer. This is a perennial problem, but it really got brought to the foreground again because so many IT and security folks struggle to maintain that critical visibility into an increasingly complex and distributed IT environment because honestly, so much of an organization and many of the organizations, so much of it is this estate is unknown or undiscovered due to things like shadow IT, M&A activity, or third-party and partner supply chain activity. So without that adequate visibility, mapping the dependencies between assets and applications and data is impossible. Oh, and also you can't roll out critical patches to applications and systems you don't know about. So getting a full picture of that data and assets is critical. So if we could just bring up slide 1 for a second, I'm sure many people have seen this graphic before, but I wanted to show it again. This is why we put data at the center of our Zero Trust extended ecosystem graphic. Data and the assets on which it flows and is stored can't be protected from malicious actors if it's unknown to the people there to protect it. So again, I really think, and we'll be talking about this in an upcoming report on our top program recommendations for security leaders coming out from Forrester in early April. Visibility and solving some of those perennial problems around IT asset discovery and management, I think, is a big deal right now for security.
Great. That's a great perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. Rajesh, would you like to address the question about how security professionals should think about protecting their companies now and maybe even into the future?
Jess, thank you so much. And Cindy, thank you so much for this question. This is very, very important, especially when it comes to managing critical environments. The way I look at it is if we take a step back, 10 years back, there were environments which maybe were like a 1 data center, at the max 2 data centers. Then they had a firewall in front of it. There was a trust and untrusted zones. And they were just completely separated in terms of, can I trust this employee or not trust this particular contractor partner? Can I trust this asset or not trust this asset? Today, when we look at the world, you have cloud as your data center. Internet is your network. You don't have MPLS T1 lines. You don't have people who are coming into the office into a trusted network and accessing these assets. You have people working from trusted environment, semi-trusted environment, untrusted environment, from home, from Starbucks, from office. And you have application architectures completely evolving. Like you have traditional application architectures, operating system-based, physical, virtual system-based architectures. Then you have containerized systems. Then you have SaaS-based systems, which is completely HTTP traffic. You have consumption model, which is API to API communication. So it is a very messy environment. 10, 15 years back, that was not the case. So in that environment, what I see today, especially IT and CISOs, they add tool after tool. They say, okay, I need to protect my identity. Let me actually have a SAML multi-factor authentication on top of it, and then privilege access management to cover identities. but that's covering the user. That's not covering system. That's not covering APIs. Then you have people coming, okay, let me try to save networks. And then let me think about network intrusion prevention, firewalling capabilities. And okay, now how do I need to manage on cloud? Don't know about it. Then I need to take care of application, which is application security, which is SaaS, RASP technologies, application control, CI/CD modeling. So they add tools on top of it. Then they think about, how do I manage data? How do I need to secure data? So then they use data security, DLP solutions along with it. In this entire model, they are not thinking holistically, if I have external users coming in, how do I defend it? If I have internal attacks happening, somebody clicks on it, ignorant user clicks on an email, clicks on an attachment, system gets compromised. And if they are connecting over VPN, what happens then? So it really begs a question as to what framework they should be using. So this is the current state of affairs. So if you ask any CISO or CIO saying that, do you have this tool? Yes, 9 out of the 10 times they have tools, but they are disjointed, fragmented, not talking to each other, and that's fundamentally the problem. So I 100% agree with Jess. It has to start with assessment. It has to start with visibility. It has to start with something that you can say, now I have certain tools. What kind of tools and systems do I need to use? But for that, the first and foremost thing is about understanding your security posture, understanding how things are basically, operating in your environment. And then you extrapolate and understand what are the network flows. What identity mappings do you need to have? What accesses you need to grant? What workloads you need to have a trusted, semi-trusted environment. So understanding those objectives become very important. So first is assessment. Then it is your defense path. Is it critical, not critical? What level of maturity do you want? And then is basically offense mechanism, which is controlling policies, governance model. So when I look at identity, application workload, devices, which is inside the network, outside the network. When I say outside the network, outside the trusted network of cloud. Every person today is accessing cloud over internet. Let's understand that. There are no T1 lines. There are no MPLS lines, secure lines. And then you have policy governance layer, which is identity, network, asset policies, application policies layered around that. And how is the access that is given to them? So from my school of thought, when I look at extremely large environment, they have to understand, assess first, then they have to basically create a game plan of what tooling to use at each layer and what frameworks to use. And those frameworks can be, if it's a critical asset, I'm not going to allow anybody, though maybe zero trust implementation can be for that carved out. And it can be 5% of the infrastructure. It can be 10% of the infrastructure. It doesn't have to be 100% of the infrastructure. And then go step by step in implementing from identity, a segmentation action plan, access plan around those. So today, most of the people who come to us talk about, I want to implement zero trust. I say, you got to have basics right. You got to have building blocks first. Do you understand who is accessing, what accesses they have, where are they accessing from? So that's what my piece of advice is, especially for infrastructure folks. Understand your environment, create a game plan around it, have clear objectives that, which are your critical assets, who are your, critical, access paths, what segmentation plan you want to have, and what controls, what level of security you want to actually implement in those environments. Cindy, you're on mute.
Yes, I am. Here I am. Thank you. Thank you, Rajesh. That was great. So Jess, I'm going to ask you another question here.
Okay.
In our hyper-connected world, and very complex one, as Rajesh just described, organizations seem to have a much more a higher increased reliance on third-party resources and vendors. And so given this, what do you think are some of the challenges that these companies are facing as barriers to adopting the principles of zero trust?
Yeah, so all of that applies, right? I think this very complex connected ecosystem, as we just discussed, within and surrounding organizations calls for a model like zero trust. But adoption of this model has been slowed in the past by the hype that's surrounding it, right? So there's been, I work with a lot of CISOs. They're a lovely, lovely group of people, but there's a fair amount of cynicism amongst that crowd, and somewhat rightly so, right? And there's the same amount of skepticism from their peers across IT, and even from executives and board members, because zero trust has been seen for so many years as a buzzword, really. You know, I think it's starting to change now, and we're going to talk about this, I think, a little bit more later. But as we see the U.S. government via the recent executive order embrace the principles of zero trust and mandate the adoption of the framework by its own agencies, this type of endorsement goes a long way in cutting through hype and demonstrating that there's a shared understanding of the principles of zero trust, you know, and national standards provided by NIST, right, for the implementation of the processes and the technologies that enable the adoption of the framework, because it isn't one monolithic thing. It is a framework that relies not only on technologies, but a heck of a lot on processes as well. So at Forrester, for our own part in reducing the hype, and I think I'm really proud to have been part of this, you know, we created this concept a decade ago, but we only just published our official definition of zero trust. So if we can bring up slide 2, I would like to actually read that for the group now, because I think it's important to have the creators of zero trust share that official definition. So here we go. So Forrester defines zero trust as an information security model that denies access to applications and data by default. And that certainly is in line with what Rajesh was just saying. Like, threat prevention is achieved by only granting access to networks and workloads utilizing policy informed by continuous, contextual, risk-based verification across users and their associated devices. And Zero Trust advocates these 3 core principles, and I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail now. So principle 1, all entities are untrusted by default. Access, we argued over that word, but we felt it really important to add default in there, because this is the definition of modern zero trust, and this is what people should be aiming for, right? So access to an organization's resources shouldn't be based off implicit trust. That trust needs to be explicitly defined and continuously reviewed and informed by context around every access session. So every decision must be assessed based on the transactional risk. And then often these pieces of context can be the posture of a device or the type of a workload or something around attributes and identity and more. So that's principle 1, all entities are entrusted by default. Principle 2, least privileged access is enforced. So users, applications, and other computing infrastructure must utilize the bare minimum amount of access needed to perform their function. If highly privileged access needs to be utilized, it needs to be assigned for that transaction and then reverted back to minimal privileges once used. Least privilege is also one of the hardest process things to get through in an organization too. It's very time consuming. Principle 3, comprehensive security monitoring is implemented. So you've got to shine a spotlight into those dark crevices of your organization, maybe some of those assets you just found, and to illuminate the threats and the adversaries that are trying to hide there. Especially now, we should be thinking about APTs and targeted attacks, right? So organizations need to pair that with the appropriate barriers and tools and processes and control mechanisms to stop, remediate, and then surgically remove or isolate those threats once they're detected. So I've been asked recently, in terms of barriers to adoption, I've been asked to speak with boards, and I've conducted workshops with some of our enterprise clients to really help security leaders get the buy-in they need to move zero trust forward. And it's really been great to see progress with our clients. There has been a lot of great progress recently.
Amazing. Thank you, Jess, for reviewing that. It's super, super informative. And now let's maybe switch gears just a little bit. So I'm going to ask Rajesh. Rajesh, I know at ColorTokens, we're seeing a very positive uptick amongst our community of security professionals who are becoming acutely aware of the benefits of microsegmentation and adopting zero trust architecture. But we know from our customer conversations, many are still very unsure where to start, and it's an arduous process. So as you mentioned before, assessment and establishing a baseline security posture is the first practical step. But since you're on the front lines every day with our customers, and they all have different security pain points and requirements, environments, please tell us what you're hearing from them and how are you advising them to start their zero trust journey, given all of this complexity?
Sure. So we have different set of customers. There are customers who are very much targeted towards solving a microsegmentation problem, because when we look at zero trust core principles, to what Jess talked about, it's fundamentally identity, understanding identity and what governance layer you have on the identity, which is identity access management, system access management, API access management, and the privilege access accounts. If somebody has keys to the kingdom, you need to know it. If some user is accessing certain applications, certain assets, high value assets, you need to know. It could be time bound, it could be service bound. But then you can't actually have a flat network trying to access it, because as soon as a user accesses one application, they can broadcast and then have an extremely major impact as soon as they enter into the network. So segmentation becomes a very important. You can go into the layers of segmentation, depending on financial services want very granular process level segmentation. Manufacturing wants the whole manufacturing plant as a segmentation. So we have customers who say, I'm actually solving the access identity problem, but can your solution specifically solve the microsegmentation solution for us? So which is separating servers, separating segments, VLAN segmentations, network segmentations, starting with visibility, understanding access exposure, and then basically implementing segmentations. We do have customers. We're talking about, I'm actually solving the segmentation, but today I have a completely different solution on the access side. So what does it mean? Access with users who are accessing this segment. Today, because we have this, especially the vendors are to be blamed for it, who are providing these solutions, they say, zero trust VPN, zero trust network access, network segmentation, I have a micro segmentation. The fundamental element is segmentation is meaningless without granting access. So you need to have a coupled impact on zero trust network access along with segmentation. So we have a very large cancer hospital based out of Houston. They targeted on micro segmentation. And they said, we have 10,000 plus servers across multiple data centers and cloud. We want to do segmentation. We have a very large, another healthcare company, which is saying, no, not just segmentation. I want to provide a zero trust network access, which means if a user or a group of users want to access a particular segment, they can get time-bound segment, they can get only to that particular footprint, and they'll not have any access to anything else. So it is user access to these segments. We do have, retail companies where they say, I have more than 800 stores worldwide. How do I basically provide this kind of a segmentation access to these particular systems? So you don't have a one or two or three data centers in one cloud. You have essentially 800 plus mini data centers, and they have to be granted access to it. It could be controlled access. And some of these are franchisees, some of these are completely owned, and some of these are completely offloaded. So you have different shades of access to these particular 800 plus stores. So that is, again, another level of implementation that we have. We have systems, we have large organizations talking about data access. They're so particular about, yes, I can control some network access, but I need very strong data governance layer. We have customers talking about implementation of microsegmentation and zero trust along the guidelines of compliance, because they are so much focusing on compliance today. And they say, great, zero trust, I will be able to apply the framework, but I need audit committee to support and grant me approval for those particular compliance. So right from protecting data, which is the data fabric governance layer, because as we were discussing earlier, in a supply chain, you have accesses across multiple things. You can't actually have data leakage on the supply chain because your competitors, and in this case, sometimes it is a state-sponsored actors, can chime in, access the data, and then it can be a very, very detrimental for. So supply chain security is predominantly around data governance layer. Compliance is another. Microsegmentation with user access. These are typically what we hear when we see different shades of zero trust implementation. Some of it is very targeted towards application security, workload security. Some of it goes beyond workload security and access. Cindy.
Yes. Great. And, I think this might be a good point, Rajesh. Jess, I was going to actually jump over and ask you about your research in the metrics part of it. But since
Sure.
Rajesh is speaking a little bit more about the actual customer experience and what we're hearing, I'm thinking that it might be great for Rajesh, if you're willing, Rajesh, to maybe give us some real world examples of some of our customers that we're dealing with and what their pain points were, and how we might have solved them with our solutions. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll turn it back over to you again, and maybe you can do a little more of a drill down into some of our customer experiences.
Sure, Cindy. So when we look at providing a zero trust journey, especially with some of our customers, it starts with, they just don't know where to start with. You just simply don't know where to start with. And that's why I just feel like, one of our critical jobs as, people who understand this is setting the expectations very clearly with those particular customers, and acknowledging it that some of these implementations can take a lot of time. And third one would be start small, don't scale it too early. And most importantly, each environment is different. So when it comes to healthcare, for them, the HIPAA compliance becomes very important. And a lot of the HIPAA compliance is more around the processes. But, touching one data into another becomes very patient critical information, right? Separation of information that what doctors can see and the rest of the staff can see becomes very, very important. So at that point in time, it is very important to understand what their governance model is, and then fit that governance model into the zero trust. So what we have observed, we also started with very hard-bound definition of zero trust when we entered into this particular journey. But as in when we started entering into and talking to customers, there's nothing like a hard-bound journey. So we had to really carve out a little, I would say, grade version of zero trust purely to fit into their model. Like, for example, if the hospital is not completely owned by the organization, then there is a line of separation. And all the accesses are granted based on certain requests. While as if you are completely owned, then they can actually directly provide an access to certain records, right? So it's not 0 or 1 in some cases. There are shades of gray. And we have tried to actually understand that shade of gray. Manufacturing, if the manufacturing is accessing this information from their vendors, most of these are very clear 0-1. Grant access, don't grant access because of the trust level. Supply chain, too much shades of gray. Some of these suppliers are completely working with them for 40 years. Some of these suppliers are 2 years old. There is still some element. These suppliers also supply it to your competitors. There's a tension developed in there. We have oil and gas companies. They work on particular projects. And these oil agencies are tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, but they work on a particular project. So separation, air gapping, data, information becomes extremely critical. These are typical examples, Cindy, what we have seen in this environment. That is why it is complex. That is why in certain cases, when you are talking about an organization, is no easy answers for it. If it's an extremely large organization, we are right now supporting zero trust implementation for an organization in discussions with them, 300 people or 300,000 people organization, right? The scale is different. So if it is a 5,000, 10,000 people organization with 5, 10, 15,000 servers, easier. But if it is, if somebody has around 20,000 partners, the complexity is completely different. And there will always be shades of gray in the. So start with fundamental building blocks. Have your 101 of security that's essentially the core thing. Have your 101 of security important. Your vulnerability, your threat assessments, your network access, network controls, granting access, user identities, absolutely important for any zero trust journey. You can't go into advanced concepts unless and until your 101 of security is implemented. Same thing we are seeing on the cloud. Cloud, people are just on a 101 of security. You talk to them about zero trust, they say, what is that? Right? So they are, still working on securing configuration management systems, configuring solutions. You see some of the competitors talking about, I have a cloud security, but they are talking essentially about a 101 of security. They are not talking about advanced concepts. Cindy, back to you.
Thank you, Rajesh. I often hear you say, don't think of zero trust as a one and done. It's a journey.
Well, it's not.
I agree, 100%. Yes.
Yeah. So, Jess, let's move on to the topic of your research in terms of measuring and putting metrics to zero trust. So interesting. Maybe you can elaborate on that for us.
Sure.
I know we've got a number of different industries represented in our audience today. And so, maybe you can talk about if you recommend different sorts of measurements and approaches based on the industries, all of that good stuff.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? We often get asked, can I have a list of metrics? No, that's really difficult to do because there are metrics that apply to your point, industry, company size, level of regulation, and also who you're speaking to within the organization. So what we've done at Forrester is tried to have a standard approach to metrics, and we've applied that to zero trust as well. But we have called it the remove the mystery from metrics method. And we categorize metrics in this way. So there's metrics can be leading, right? They forecast what's coming and allow the organization to decide how to handle what's coming next. They can be lagging. They demonstrate trends and progressions that are based on prior decisions and activities, or they can be coincident, right? They suggest or dictate the next best action given current conditions. No one is better than the other. It's just a category of metrics. And then we further categorize those by, are they strategic, right? Is this at the executive level? Are they showing executives the current and potential business impact of security risks and the efforts to mitigate them? Are they operational? Is that the kind of across for the CISO, providing an overview of performance and relationships across the organization? So maybe that's for the CISO's peers again. And then there's tactical. This would be for the security team, right? These metrics apply to staff who directly control technologies and processes across the security workflows. So that's how we think about metrics. And this is also how we think about zero trust metrics as well. So to us, zero trust metrics focus on the ability of your firm to do a few things. One, protect customers' data while preserving their trust. So at the strategic level, you could look at a metric like, how have our acquisition or retention rates changed after a breach, right? This is pretty high level, but again, this is something that if you're going to market as a trusted business, zero trust absolutely plays into this. I know it's strange to hear trust and zero trust, but they are very much intertwined. An operational example of a metric like that would be at what rate are our customers adopting multi-factor to our sites or our applications, right? Customer identity and access management is incredibly important. And it's protecting their data while preserving their trust. And that's something you can do to show them that you are trying to preserve their trust and you have their best interest in mind. And then at a tactical level, you could think of what percentage of our customer data is encrypted, right? So that's all around protecting customers' data while preserving their trust. And then zero trust metrics can also really be focused on recruiting and retaining happy, productive employees who appreciate security. We're all about instilling security cultures within organizations at Forrester. We write a lot about it and feel very strongly that security is everybody's responsibility, as do many of you on this webinar, I'm sure. But so let's think about it from a strategic level, board level, executive level. How satisfied are our employees? Right? That's extremely important right now in the Great Resignation. And it does tie into how they can do their job while maintaining security. At an operational level, how strong is our identity management and governance process? How many exceptions to the policy are granted? Right? That's something to look at in terms of what does the employee experience look like and how can we achieve that least privilege? And then tactical is 2FA for employees implemented? Is privileged access management implemented? All really important stuff. And then another category you can think of for metrics that's related to zero trust is guarding the firm's IP and reducing the costs of security incidents. So at a strategic level, is our firm a target for corporate espionage? That's a big thing right now. Is it a target for nation state actors, right? And what do we need to do at a strategic level? What board level or executive level decisions need to be made based on that metric? And then operational, what is our data hosting model, right? Where does the sensitive data live? And is that changing over time? That could also go into that visibility piece. What are we seeing? What are we not seeing when it comes to assets? What are we doing about shadow IT? Could all be at that level or at the strategic level for that matter. And then at the tactical level, is sensitive data classified as sensitive? Is it encrypted? So these are just a few examples, but again, we like to help people think about it from that organizational perspective where they can look at their metrics and maybe use the ones that they have, but change them to be leading, lagging, and coincident, and make sure that they're at the right audience level as well. Are they tactical and you're trying to present that to the board, or are you really thinking about what actionable metric do you need to put in front of executives that's going to further your program along? So again, it's more of our whole philosophy, but I think it ties really well to the zero trust principles as well.
Right. And, another thing to think about is this whole issue of cyber insurance. And,
gosh, yeah.
I've heard that there's been sort of the staggering 500% increase in ransomware claims from 2020 to 2021. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective, what are insurers expecting from, organizations in terms of their cybersecurity program? I'm sure this is another layer that has to be addressed and from a business perspective and taken into consideration, all the way up the food chain, probably to the board level. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is the interesting thing. This is getting attention at the board level. And this is something that, as painful as it may be to experience a policy renewal where your premium has gone up 150, 200, 500%, and your coverage has gone down and been narrowed significantly, it has also been, according to the security leaders that I work with, this, the stick when no other carrots have worked, right? Like the board is just not put in that investment. They have not been evangelists for security. They have not wanted to invest the time even to change processes. But in order to get that policy renewed, in order to even try to go flat the next year after this 150% increase, they're going to have to make some changes, fundamental changes to their overall security posture. So I see this messy situation with cyber insurance is sort of a rising tide that's going to end up lifting all boats, honestly. So, ransomware gangs, though they may have sophisticated as a service models that we've heard all about, and the customer support and all of that, they're opportunists at heart, right? They're getting in in the easiest way possible. And if they can't, they're going to move on after a period of time trying, right? Our data showed us the way they got in. It's mostly through phishing and, other ways of getting in, vulnerabilities. But, how do we stop them from launching a destructive attack or exfiltrating critically sensitive data or IP? And again, this is not just something on the mind of CISOs, senior executives in the board. It's very, very much top of mind for cyber insurance carriers too. If we could just pull up slide 3 quickly, I think this is some important stuff. And this is something that your insurance carriers, they really want to know that you covered yourselves with the basics, right? They're thinking about overall security posture now. They didn't before. Everyone got a policy and now they're paying out, but now they want to know that you covered yourselves with the basics for protection against ransomware and other attacks. So this graphic here is from our ransomware survival guide that we published late last year. And there's a whole tool for our clients that we've created where they can understand where they stand in terms of tools and processes in place to defend their organizations against ransomware attacks. And again, this is from that report. And this is the basics right here. When it comes to the first stage of ransomware defense, the essentials are backups, configuration changes, and prevention. And this stage is really the easiest to implement and requires the least number of resources. This is very much like the beginning phases of Zero Trust 2. If you just put in something like 2FA, you're well on your way. So the basics focus on stopping the most common ransomware attacks and ensuring a successful recovery from backup for any attacks that happen to get through. And these recommendations are really the bread and butter of ransomware defense. And they also happen to line up really well with frameworks like NIST IR 8374, which is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Profile for Ransomware Risk Management. It also lines up very well with Australia's Essential 8 and to guidance from the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. So, adopting a Zero Trust framework and maturing your processes and technology in each pillar really provides you with those basic protections and more, preparing you not only to withstand those opportunistic attacks, but to fortify yourself against worse, like targeted attacks. And I think now cyber insurance carriers are really going back to, they're looking to, insurance is really to be there to protect you against an unforeseen, unknown attack. Ransomware isn't that anymore. Right? So they expect you to have those basics in place or you're not going to get the premium. You may not even get a policy. You might get dropped. So, it's a very interesting world. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with cyber insurance in 2022 and beyond.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. That was really enlightening about cyber insurance. Who knew?
Cindy, can I add a couple of points?
Yes, please, Rajesh, please jump in.
Jess, you're bringing a very important point, especially on the cybersecurity and the 101 of it. I just also feel a lot of times board, CIOs, CEOs feel that it's a humongous cost and let's defer it for next year, then next year, especially around cybersecurity and Zero Trust. What they don't understand, some of it started to actually do that. I've attended a few board meetings where I was invited into that purely to talk about the cybersecurity. What is helping that, especially around modernization of workforce, people are working from different locations. And that's just creating a lot of pressure on IT because they are just not scaled to deliver at that level. And what do? They just put an open network. Exponential increase in their cyber risk. And that is significantly increasing their premiums, cyber insurance premium, because people know how many people are actually, organizations know how many people are working from remote, like 80%, 90% of people are working remote these days, right? So your exposure is exponential. Second is the, enabling cost of doing business. It is very important to actually sustain in today's world. If you are not cloud first mobile workforce, you'll not be able to hire people, with the result that you're not able to exponentially grow in these environments. So it is becoming, one is the cybersecurity element. Other thing is doing business. That is also becoming a very important element. Third is if you have these 101 of security and advanced level of security, your premium is going to significantly come down. One of the things, Jess, that we are actually right now working on, and it hasn't taken a proper shape, but working with cyber insurance companies, where we work with them and say, if they actually have these controls, the premium will come down, because this is essentially a cyber compliance, cyber practice. So we are working along those lines also with cyber insurance companies, where they can actually run these particular reports, where they can show some of this could be a 101 security, some of them could be on advanced, and some of them could be on super advanced level, because that way they can actually safeguard and reduce the cost as well.
Thank you, Rajesh, for that. Okay, well, let's, speaking of policies, let's move on to President Biden's executive order. And this is really our last question that I'd like to pose to perhaps both of you. So we know that the executive order is in place to improve America's cybersecurity, but enlighten us a little bit about what that entails. What do companies need to do for compliance? And furthermore, how will it bring trust and transparency to, these complex digital infrastructures? So Jess, would you like to maybe start with that one? And Rajesh, if you have thoughts on that, we can go to you.
This is definitely probably one for both of us, but the executive order is huge. So I'd like to just focus on the elements that are related to zero trust. So the executive order establishes zero trust as the unified approach to cybersecurity for the U.S. federal government, and it creates a zero trust strategy along with a zero trust maturity assessment from CISA, which is fantastic, right? And it also serves as validation for zero trust in the private sector, as I was saying earlier. This really goes a long way, and we were very excited about this at Forrester, and we've had folks, colleagues, past and present, that have helped worked on things like NIST and are also, working directly with these agencies to further zero trust along. So, what should we expect in the future? Well, massive breaches such as the incidents that happened at the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, and the software supply chain attacks by Nobilium, right, the SolarWinds, right, they necessitated the modernization of how the federal government implements security. So the executive order calls out investing in both technology and people to deliver on their modernization goals. And that reinforces the fact that organizations can't look at technology alone. And we say this all the time, it's the only thing that's part of the protection equation. In fact, and this is really interesting stuff, CISA made some pretty incredible strides in providing competitive salaries to practitioners. They're looking to recruit from the private sector. So, one of our recommendations for security leaders is to look at your salary bands, because the government just got competitive, right? And that's something that private sector has to think about as well, not necessarily in the context of zero trust, but in the context of the great talent shortage that is out there. You need people to implement zero trust and all the other parts of your security program. So, again, evaluating your people's posture, skills, resources should be a critical part of any technology changes that you're doing. And you really do need to think about your retention strategy. And then, massive strategy shifts on the part of the government and policy changes like this require big sweeping technology adjustments. So federal agencies must implement and operate the following, right? They've got to do multi-factor authentication, data classification and encryption, endpoint detection and response, appropriate logging across systems, and then moving of systems to the cloud, which is great. And CISA is going to provide guidance on those requirements. And actually, if we could pull up slide 4, I wanted to show the parallels in how CISA is thinking about zero trust and how that lines up with ours. So as agencies move to the cloud, they're going to need to design their zero trust architectures and establish their logging requirements. And I think this is where we should expect new investments and potential consolidation of systems, right? Enabling zero trust alone is going to require more supporting technologies such as Zero Trust Edge or SASE, microsegmentation, cloud workload security, privileged identity management, and a lot more. So, while the majority of CISOs that I work with exist in the private sector and might think of these changes as something that's not really going to affect them, I think the opposite is true, right? The executive branch of the US federal government validated zero trust and a host of technologies at the same time. So much like the NIST cybersecurity framework in 2014, I would expect that if they haven't started asking you about it already, your board and other C-level stakeholders are going to start asking you about zero trust. So this is perfect, right? This is your way in. So use the executive order to your advantage and push your zero trust strategy forward, or get started on your zero trust journey because of this. And then use the NIST guidance to implement those needed processes and technologies. Forrester also has a practical guide to zero trust implementation that our clients can use as a starting point as well. And there are a number of technology providers like ColorTokens too that can help with this.
Excellent perspective, Jess. Thank you so very much. Rajesh, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
We're already seeing the change, Cindy. We're already seeing the change in the federal sector. I have been in many discussions with the federal agencies, different agencies, and they are already talking about zero trust and the mandate that has come through. What's very interesting to see, and this is possibly the first time where I see a real motivation, a driving force within that organization to actually make a big difference. And it was, as Jess said, that they are making structural changes to adopt to these standards. And they're welcoming private organizations, corporations to help them into this particular journey. So it is going all the way from a senior executives working with us, saying that what all changes we need to adopt. So on the ground, it's so interesting to see in just few months, this change that where they invited many of the cybersecurity experts to see what essential changes need to happen in those and they are large organizations. And the biggest change that personally I see, because I've been working with them for many years, is the flexibility, the motivation, and help. They need help. They need partners who can actually help them into this journey. And other thing is a massive transformation of workforce. Workforce need to be educated and trained, because the dynamics have changed. And we are seeing a significant uptick in just not only the conversations, but in terms of let's actually take a small footprint, deploy it there, have a crawl, walk, run strategy, and then take the journey on the zero trust.
Great, thank you, Rajesh. So I think we're running up against our time here, but we do have time for maybe just one question from our audience that I'll pose to both of you. And the question is zero trust going to be the default security of the future? And how can I start doing a posture assessment?
Let me take that up.
Sure.
Yes, I'll take that up. So in terms of zero trust as the default posture, I think you should first look at security. I think it's very important to understand zero trust is a framework, but there is a certain hygiene needed. And independent of you want to implement zero trust day one, or you want to think about it in future, first thing is manage your risks, understand your environment, understand your network flows, understand your access, understand your identities, understand your communication of applications. If it's a legacy applications, encryption needs to be there. If it's non-legacy, 9 out of the 10 times it will be already encrypted traffic. Your data governance layer, residency of the data is very important. A lot of times these are fundamental things. Then if you are as organization which is also rolling out some of the softwares, you need to think about the source, which is open source, vulnerabilities, areas where you need to apply patches, your configuration compliance. These are fundamental. Don't consider this as a moment to actually implement zero trust. It's basically a fundamental hygiene in your environment that you need to do no matter what. Then comes the strategy of, okay, I have these many assets. Where do I need to have tighter controls? That is where you need to carve it out. That might be 10% of your infrastructure, 20% of your infrastructure. Have very clear goals defined for it. And then you think about how do I couple identity and access with those particular assets. Start with that. Don't boil the ocean. you're not going to get it. Otherwise, it'll just look like you're taking these Lego blocks and not able to find a particular model. So think it from a perspective of 101 security, fundamental elements. Second is critical assets, most important things that you want to, then you will have a better control. And once you have those particular critical assets, it could be users, it could be devices, it could be applications, it could be workloads, whatever that is, and then couple it with identity and access. What all identities you want to, and what access I want to grant.
That's right.
You will be in a much, much better state. Have that framework across.
Yeah,
Well
couldn't
said,
agree more.
Rajesh.
And again, I'm kind of biased, and the question was, do we think this is going to be the default framework for the future? I do, and maybe it won't be called that, right? But I think, to Rajesh's point, by taking it down to the simplest form of identities and access, and understanding that those are intrinsically tied, and you cannot just grant access to any particular identity. It has to have context. There has to be some sort of a risk-based decision made with every transaction, which is why, again, we put the default in the definition. I think it is the right formula for a standard moving forward, for sure.
We agree. Okay, so that actually, we're at time, and so that's going to wrap up our session on the definition of modern zero trust. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to both of you, Jess and Rajesh, for joining us today. It's been so thought-provoking. And thank you all for joining us and participating. I'm sorry we didn't have time for a lot of questions, but if you do have additional questions, feel free to come to colortokens.com. We'll be happy to answer anything that you have. And again, thank you very much. And we hope that you all have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.